Hey everyone, it's your girl Maddie here, aka Beavermotch, and today I am joined by Lee Harrison of Monstrosity, who has a new album coming out off of Metal Blade Records, From Beneath the Surface, coming out March 13th. And Lee, it's been about 7 years since the last Monstrosity album. How does it feel to, be getting out new music, after this kind of gap in time?
Uh, Good. Even though it never really stopped, it just takes us forever for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
there was an 11-year gap between Pastor the
right,
Virtual Apocalypse, so not necessarily that new for you.
right.
Um,
Usually it's 4 years between like the first few albums. It was like that was our average was 4 years. We'd
yeah.
take a couple years to tour for the album, and then maybe a year to write it, and then a year to record it. It was kind of how it worked out. But yeah, we get older now, and there's other issues and lineup changes and things that happen that slow the process down.
Yeah. Now, Lee, you're the primary songwriter for Monstrosity, and I'm wondering how exactly that works out. Do you tell the guitarist what you think they should do? Or are you actually kind of hands-on with the guitar parts, or how does
Um,
that work?
well, I do play guitar.
Yeah.
I've played guitar. I did a tour with Obituary in 2012. I was with Pete Sandoval and Terrorizer. I played guitar for that for 2013 to 2020, and did a project with Midnight from Crimson Glory before he passed away, where I was doing all kinds of bass, keyboards, all kinds, playing. I was basically the whole band behind him in some songs. But yeah, and like as far as back as Imperial Doom, like even before Imperial Doom, uh, really since I was, when I was a kid, like a high school kid, I would do demos where I would record drums into like a little tape deck, and then I'd put that cassette tape into my stereo, and then I would play along with that on guitar, and then record that on a different thing. So I was doing like budget, homemade, bootleg kind of like uh, recordings that way back when I was a kid, and then uh, when I was in Malevolent, I did some 4-track demos where I was like playing everything myself.
Yeah.
And then when I got out of Malevolent, I did a whole little album thing, and a lot of those riffs ended up, we ended up plucking some of those riffs for Imperial Doom.
Sure.
So I've always been playing guitar basically, and it's just but sometimes I have the drums first. Sometimes I
Yeah.
just write guitar riffs and then I'll put the drums to it after the fact. And then other times, like I'll come up with a riff and it maybe even something that I can't play, but I'll tell the guitar player, here's what you do, and then
Yeah.
they're I'm a good guitar player, but they're like great guitar players, so I'll get them to do, what I can't do.
Sure. Now I want to talk about your upcoming set at Maryland Deathfest. You are sharing the stage with some big names, Napalm Death, Sinister, Organ Dealer. How excited are you for that night?
It should be cool. We go back with Napalm, basically since when they came over for Morrisound for
Yeah.
Harmony Corruption. We hung out with them then. They came out to like, I think it was a death show, maybe. Yeah, pretty sure it was a death show. And
Yeah.
we hung out then. And yeah, I used to see Jesse around when he'd come to town. Um, Trying to think. Actually, Barney got up with us and did Angel of Death in like 2003, maybe.
Sure.
So we go back with those guys a long time, and definitely cool. And Sinister's on that show too. We've known them. Ad the drummer. Well, he's now the singer. We've known him. We've known him for a long time.
Yeah.
Basically every time we go to Europe, we usually run into him. He comes out to the shows and hangs out. So
Yeah.
definitely cool. Always good to play Maryland.
Yeah. It's one thing I like about Monstrosity's music, one thing that I really appreciate, going back to, even your older records like Millennium and Imperial Doom, is you're able to combine like that. very old school approach to death metal with a sort of technical layering and stuff. How do you find that balance?
Well, you know, our original bass player Mark Van Erp was in the band Cynic
Yes.
when I met him, and back then Cynic was more of a thrash band. They weren't so kind of jazzy as they later became, obviously.
Yeah.
And we were, I always kind of dug that, that because they had like a technical thing going, even with the thrash metal. But kind of when I went off, I was hanging around those guys, and then I went up to Fort Lauderdale to join Malevolent, and Malevolent was kind of doing more of the brutal Slayer type thing, where it was
Yeah.
just more direct, whatever. So I kind of had, it was kind of we've always kind of had that thing where we like combine the two things, where it's kind of we got some of that technical edge because we enjoy playing like that, where it's like challenging and stuff that we can't play, we try to aspire to. Um, but at the same time, we like playing the brutal stuff, the kind of stuff that's maybe a little more memorable, a little more, straightforward, 4/4
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Um, that's kind of been the balance, with Imperial Doom. It was a lot more straightforward and brutal. With Millennium, we kind of went off on a tangent with some of the, just because we had a guitar player that could play anything that we needed. So, admittedly, we kind of went off on a tangent with the technical stuff on that album. And just from playing some of those songs live, you could tell that some of those songs kind of like didn't really work in a live situation. So with the third album, we kind of brought it back to kind of more of a
Yeah.
balance to where it's, and so we have the brutal stuff and the technical, and the kind of ever since In Dark Purity, our third record, we've kind of kept that same formula where we definitely, still do technical things, and it's not like we have a rule, don't no technical things, but we try to streamline it too and not make it too like it just gets, when the fans, they can't get into it,
Yeah.
we don't, because we noticed that with Cynic early on, that like we could see it, that as they developed, they got more and more crazy, and we could just see, you could see the fan reaction that they did, like they didn't know how to react to that music, it was kind
Yeah.
of, whereas something like Deicide or Malevolent, they can just sit there and bang their head and get into it. And we don't want to be simplified. We're not trying to, and I'm not purposely writing for the fan base, we're writing for ourselves first and foremost. But that's kind of what we like too, is that balance. So
Yeah. I saw Cynic at MDF last year, and I can tell what you mean. Like it was very cool to observe and see, but like it's hard to just, I don't know, bang your head to it. It's
right,
very
jam,
much yeah.
you
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
but I love those guys,
Yeah.
Paul and Sean, they were brothers, back in the day. They were,
Yeah.
I don't I lost kind of lost contact when they split up and kind of went out to California and did their whole thing. And I don't really see them as much, but you know, they were a great band. It's unfortunate kind of the way what happened with Sean and passing away and everything.
Yeah.
Because
Now you put out your debut record in '92, Imperial Doom. Death metal was kind of, in its heyday there. But did you expect that, back then in the early '90s that death metal would still have a life and a big fan base, in 2026?
no, no,
Yeah.
I remember an interview in like '90 with Trevor Perez reading, and he was like, "Well, hopefully it makes it to '94." Like
Yeah.
it was, and here we are
Yeah.
today. So,
Yeah. I mean, I was not alive in '92 and I'm, going back and listening to those old records. Does that
and
make you?
you could argue even in '92 things were
Yeah.
kind of oversaturated and kind of like on the way down, because the mainstream really hit like '89, '90, '91. By the time we came out, you could almost argue it was on a downward turn at that point, just because there were
Yeah.
so many bands playing death metal,
Right.
Immolation, Suffocation, Gore Guts. I mean, there was just, a bunch. But yeah, we were just glad to be part of the whole thing.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so take me back. So we're 92, Imperial Doom comes out, and then I'm just curious, black metal starts coming around the corner, like around that time, like the mid 90s. What was your reaction to that?
There was good and bad. Um, there was some stuff that was just like, uh, you know, to my ears unlistenable. It was like, but we loved it at the time. We were into that just obscure, great. Like we kind of liked anything
Yeah.
crazy and brutal at that time. Um, but as it, I'd say like more like 94, 95, 96 is kind of really when that became like the labels were, like Borovoy, the guy who does Blabbermouth, actually, he was working for Century Media.
Hmm.
And we were trying to get a deal with Century Media around 95. And he basically said, look, your band can be the best band ever and most talented and fastest band and this and that. But, the fact is the labels aren't signing death metal right now. They're off on, they're signing black metal bands, right?
Yeah.
So there was a time there where like it was kind of uncool to be death metal just because the fad or the trend or whatever you want to call it had kind of died out as far as record labels and the mainstream media. So to for that underground mainstream underground media, if you will, it wasn't it was kind of the whole trendiness of like your average guy, I mean, because they used to play death metal at the strip clubs, like
Yeah.
that's unheard of in this day and age. That's never going to happen, So it was just more commercially acceptable back then. And then it kind of and like I said, there was good bands and bad bands. Like a band like Immortal, they they do it, where it's tight and it's musical and there's actually stuff going on. And then there's bands that can barely tune their instruments, and
Yeah.
to me, it's yeah, I'm not so much into that. Uh,
Sure.
but there's good and bad and everything, like just depends. It's more about a feel and the dark, the feeling of that. Sometimes these bands they can get that across without being like super technical or anything like with big production.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because and I'm sure you had to feel something with black metal and like Mayhem saying that they were a reaction to death metal coming too oversaturated. But it seems like you kind of agree with that assessment to an extent.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I think they had nowhere to go. Like
Yeah.
to make a new thing to where they could come up, they couldn't just be the 50th death metal band or the
Right.
100th death metal band. They had to like kind of they saw the writing on the wall as far as that, and so they kind of reinvented themselves as with the whole image, corpse paint, blah 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 thing going
Yeah.
on. So, and you could argue that got trendy. That
Sure.
the same thing that happened with that. Happened with death metal happened with that, and where it went from there was kind of the because we were more extreme than thrash metal, and so that
Yeah.
black metal that their kind of goal was to be more extreme than death metal, and we were with that, we like, we were down with being more extreme, so
Yeah.
we were kind of okay with it. But it was just, some of the bands just relied on the image too much rather than
Sure.
and the music was just kind of
Yeah.
but
I
there's, like I said, there's good and bad and everything. Dark Funeral, killer. That drummer's, the drummers they've had are for, they've had some sick guys, and we've toured with them. So I've, been side of the stage and watched them. They're killer.
yeah.
Uh,
What's it like feeling wise to have newer bands like Tomb Mold or Blood Incantation, bands like that, listing bands that you've been a part of as influences. Is how much of an honor is that?
that's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, you know, uh, I don't, I can't, to be honest, I can't say I've listened to either one of those bands.
yeah,
I haven't heard them, to be honest. But I'm sure they're good at what they do, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. They seem to be breaking out. That's always kind of amazed me. It's like how bands can go from obscurity to all of a sudden they're the new thing.
Yeah,
So it's been interesting to see that with younger bands. Certain younger bands come along, and even Slipknot, for example. They
sure.
came. Like where'd they come from? And now all of a sudden they're just everybody's all over the radio, and they're the huge. You know,
Well, now we're talking new metal. What was your reaction to that?
uh, you know, uh, it just seemed like a younger, like kind of the same thing where like a younger generation had to find their own niche,
Sure.
same way black metal tried to find its own niche.
Yeah,
Uh, and there's some things that I'm not really a big fan of that screamy kind of vocal, where it's
sure.
what, just I
Yeah.
don't know, it's kind of annoying to me. But uh, again, I'm sure there's killer, like some of that gent stuff, like there's some killer musicians in there, that I've
Yeah.
seen. Um, but you could argue it sounds, there's bands that sound the same, and it's like that in everything. I think there's good and bad in everything, and it just depends, on what we're talking about and who we're talking about.
The last question I have for you is one I think you probably get asked a lot, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You're from Florida, and Florida is seems to be a breeding ground for death metal bands. Why?
More sound
Yeah,
was definitely helped. Not that there wouldn't, not that there's bands everywhere, but I just think they got more notice because it helped that we had more sound.
yeah,
Um, and the thing is that even though like people still consider Florida death metal and this and that, but really it's the same bands. It's Cannibal Corpse, Deicide, Morbid Angel, Monstrosity, Malevolent Creation, and then Massacre, Atheist, Cynic. But then what? The Diabolic, maybe they were a little bit later to the game, but
yeah,
at that after 98, 99, there really hasn't been a new band that's kind of like come into the international scene, so to speak, and really, I mean, there's killer bands from Tampa, but nobody's really gotten the notice, the notoriety. So like, and then even though we had the bands, it was still like the same 200 to 400 people in the crowd
yeah,
that we would get in like Texas or wherever, you know what I mean? It's like the same amount of people, and they come and go and all that, but it's more or less that same amount of people. So it wasn't like Tampa death metal. There's just thousands and thousands of death metal fans going to shows, and where it's not like that anywhere else. It
yeah,
was just the fact that the bands themselves were from here, and a lot of that was helped by the fact that we had Morrisound, who became known for death metal, and kind of everybody went. It was a real studio with sonically treated walls, and tall ceilings, and a real
yeah.
console, and real equipment, and Jim and Tom Morris, who were pretty much geniuses at what they do. Scott Burns, so we were lucky to have that, and at the time you didn't really realize it, but it's not like you can go to just down the street and they're gonna somebody else is gonna have a studio like that. That it's there was only like three studios like that in Florida. There was
Hmm.
Criteria down in Fort Lauderdale with Miami, um, and they did like Bee Gees and Fleetwood Mac and Eagles and that kind of,
Sure.
but that was a big studio. Then there was one, I think there's one in Orlando. I forget the name of it, but same kind of thing. Maybe one in Jacksonville, but it's not like you can just go down the street and find these kind of studios.
Hmm.
So, and especially more sound just because they kind of created that, the triggering of the bass drums. They were
Yeah,
doing that even before bands were doing it, live. it was something that it was a technique that was created in the studio where they would come off the tape and go into a machine and come it would go back onto a different track on the tape, and that made it to where like you could actually hear the bass drums, and the drums were more of a focus rather like where some albums like from some of the German bands, Creator, Sodom,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. It just even Pestilence, like the first Pestilence, some of those drum sounds are a little wonky. Just it's just the studios weren't up to date. Like Morrisound kind of came and revolutionized that whole death metal sound, and helped put because it sounded good. It helped some of these bands that normally wouldn't be known for sounding good. It made them sound good.
Yeah. Well, Lee, I want to thank you for your time and joining me today. For everyone, make sure you look out for the new Monstrosity record. It's Screen from Beneath the Surface coming out March 13th off of Metal Blade Records. For everyone watching at home, keep it metal. I mean,
And where are you located?
I'm in Minneapolis.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
awesome. All right, well,
Maddie.
hopefully we get up that way on
Yeah,
tour.
cool. Well, for everyone watching at home, see ya.